coming. There's only an hour, so I'm going to get going right away. No time to spare on this one. So permissionless innovation and the law. What could that be about? I bet you have no idea. Here's my outline. I have some disclaimers. And I go into like philosophically, like what is law? I'm going to try to bust some harmful legal myths. Talk about permissionlessly innovating in law. And I'm going to talk about crypto law. What is crypto law? Like basics of crypto law. And then I'm going to have a conclusion. So, disclaimers. I'm not responsible for how you use the information in this talk. There's only so much responsibility that I can take for what you do. And I'm trying to be responsible. But there's only so much that I can do. And you're going to have to be responsible for your actions. You're not getting any kind of permission from me. I don't have that kind of authority. Please be responsible. People have kind of pointed me in the direction of the law and challenged my legal thinking, but I am responsible for the contents of this talk. If you have any beefs, come talk to me. But also not during the talk. I have lots to go through. Please come after. And the main reason why I'm giving this talk really is because I have big legal problems, or I see big legal problems, and I think they need to be urgently addressed. And so I'm trying to help, make that happen by providing, a bunch of information, encouragement, etc. So, what is law? This is the definition that I'm using. When I say law, this is what I mean. Law probably or might mean something else to you, and that's okay, but this is what I mean, so when I'm talking, this is what I'm talking about. So legal order is the structure of disputes, and law is basically all of the ways that disputes can play out. Another way that I say this is by changing the word disputes for conflict. So law is the structure of conflict, or all the different ways that conflict can play out. Does law exist? Or, if it doesn't, how does it exist? Well, basically, it exists axiomatically as long as there's conflict. As long as there's conflict, there's some ways that it can play out, and that's where law is. So it exists as long as there's conflict, as long as there are disputes. And where does it exist? Well, if people exist, then in some extent, some way, and they all exist in the same world, then in some way the law exists also in that world with them. Wherever they're having conflict, law exists. There's a concept called a legal matrix. A person's legal matrix is all their experiences, judgments, perceptions, worldviews, assumptions, etc. that make up how they perceive and they experience and they judge that disputes will play out. So my legal matrix is kind of made up of the ways that I experience legal reality. It's kind of personal to an extent. And the legal matrix just absolutely is the aggregate collection of every person's legal matrices. So the legal matrix is kind of made up of everyone's perceptions, realities, worldviews about how they have conflict. And so law exists both inside and outside of people's legal matrix, because it's somewhat defined in people's perceptions and experiences, but also there are things outside of people's perceptions and experience that will determine and influence the way conflict plays out. Random events, things about the universe, things that are written down but no one's thinking about right now. And so just to give an illustration, I made this tweet a little while ago, and I said, oh look, this is a legal order. This is between termites and ants. And if you can imagine that each one of these ants has a kind of legal matrix. The ones on the front line there are directly kind of experiencing the conflict with the ants in front of them, and they have beliefs or kind of a state about how that's going to play out. And the legal order is kind of the social order that comes about because of the structure of the disputes between these ants and termites. So, legal order is emergent, and it emerges out of individual people's choices and perspectives on the conflicts they're having. So, law exists kind of all over the place. It's kind of complicated. It's in every source of the structure of conflict. Law is ontologically very complex, meaning that its existence is complicated. It's really hard to say this is law here and that's it. That's the whole of the law. So now let's use this definition or this framework to kind of bust some common legal myths. Firstly, though, why are legal myths so common? Well, firstly, like, law is incredibly complex. People can't really be expected to reason clearly about complex topics. And, law is really as complex as life. It's really, very, very complex. And so mythology works to get people to do things and act and have kind of coherence in the context of inconceivable complexity. And law is incredibly old. It's incredibly old, incredibly complex. It's older than speech, writing, and culture itself, because conflict existed before any of these things. People had conflicts over food, territory, way before they learned to speak and write and have, what are thought of as modern legal institutions. So people's experience of law is kind of a result of long history, and there's various myths that have kind of long histories. And so because it's so old and institutionalized and complex, these myths kind of carry about, they kind of are propagated. So legal argument is done in the context of people's legal matrices. If I'm trying to convince you to do something, to change your behavior, I have to appeal to like the legal gods that you recognize, to the mythology that you see and that you believe. And so if I'm gonna have some kind of legal discourse with you to try to change your behavior, I have to appeal to basically your legal matrix. And if your legal matrix has some common myths in it, one way for me to do that, rather than having to change your mind and your worldview, is to just kind of buy into the myth, use your legal matrix to manipulate you based on what kind of conflict you recognize. So, the prevailing tradition is to study the legal history and become familiar with the legal doctrines, norms, and institutions that people use today. To kind of learn, how is this law that it got here? Where did it get from? And so people, when they learn about law, learn all these myths, or some of these myths, because of the kind of historical facts about how law came to be the way it is. So because of these kind of historical complexity reasons, and because of the nature of trying to convince someone of something, there's a lot of legal myths all over the place. And there are also people and institutions who directly benefit from legal myths, and so they're actively defended. Sometimes they're defended just out of like, it gives me cognitive dissonance when someone disagrees with my myth, and so I'll just have to defend it. But often it's, unwitting self-preservation, where like the way that you orient yourself in the world is kind of based on legal stories. And if those legal stories are threatened, then all of a sudden, you feel insecure. Like, and people also feel threatened also just if you tell them something that they don't understand, and you act like it has like legal force, and that also kind of can make people feel threatened. So people have, actively defend legal myths, and so and often for just their immediate benefit, whether it's comfort or actual power that they get to have because of the legal stories. So let's go through. I have 11 legal myths. So law is slow, static, and it's not innovative. Common legal myth. Reality is that law responds in real time to the conflicts that people are having right away. And people, will even preempt the conflicts they might have with legal work today. The law responds even in advance of conflict. It preempts conflict. So, law is really, really much less slow and static than people imagine, because people usually focus on particular legal institutions that have a lot of momentum and that have kind of these myths that they monopolize law. We'll get into those myths soon. And they kind of have this idea that, law is slow. And that's just not true. Not true at all. Law is expensive. People believe this, but the law is not a market good. You can't buy law. You can buy legal services. And legal services can be expensive, but they're not law, right? You pay for someone to represent you in a dispute. You're not buying law. You're buying legal services. Someone who's going to represent you. Maybe you hire a mediator. You're not buying law. You're buying someone who's going to participate in your dispute. You're not buying the people, obviously. Nowadays, you're just buying their services. Law is coercive. Another super common myth. Law is not inherently violent, although it obviously does and can sanction coercion. People have many ways of dealing with disputes, preventing them, not just violence, not just coercive force. The coercive kind of side of law is, there because coercion is involved in conflict. But lots of law is not coercive, and law is not inherently coercive. In fact, lots of legal philosophy is specifically set up to prevent coercion, to get people to, voluntarily change their behavior and to be voluntarily more lawful instead of having to be forced. So, the idea that law is coercive is just a myth. The law is code. People kind of believe this, and it's not true. I mean, law is informationally, ontologically, epistemologically much more complex than code. It exists in not a single computational environment like code does. Code has a semantics, that's usually has a formal semantics. Law doesn't exist in a single place like that. Law is much more complex than code. The law is not like code. I split 4 into 2 because I didn't want to renumber the myths. Code is law. Also kind of a myth. So the idea, although most people don't really believe this, I just bring this up because it comes up in the space a lot. While some legal orders are kind of the result of interpretation and enforcement of written laws that are not more than complex than code because they're just kind of, formal writing on a single medium. However, the interpretation and enforcement of laws, of written codes, is never the whole of the law. And that's just because law is the structure of all of the conflict, and it's never going to be the case that all of the conflict can be encoded. Because, you can have conflict about that. There's conflict and disputes are more complex than anything you could write down. It's just as a person who's writing things down in a system in which the disputes is taking place. It's just informationally going to be impossible to write down the whole of the law. So, code is never the whole of the law. And thinking of code as law is usually deeply problematic. Law that is not enforced by the government or the state is not law. Common myth. Very common myth. People have many, many, many ways that they manage disputes. And not all are dominated by the possible or actual intervention through national law. It's just a myth that only law that's enforced is law. And it's a very harmful myth, actually, because there's lots of law that isn't recognized by this rule. And I think I have another myth soon to follow up on that. Another myth, law is inherently territorial. Again, people have lots of complex disputes that go across territories, and the territoriality of certain kinds of legal order doesn't apply for all of them. It's not inherently territorial because conflict is not inherently territorial. There was maybe, some disputes are inherently territorial, but not all. And so law itself is not inherently territorial. Common myth. And then another one, law is the turf of legal professionals. Okay, laws existed for way longer than the professionalization of law. People making professions out of helping people with disputes one way or another, avoiding them, having them, mediating them, resolving them, is a natural specialization because conflict is complicated and people aren't going to want to go it alone. But legal professionals provide legal services, and they, for the most part, have very little agency in governing the law. They're mostly participating in a legal system and have relatively little agency in governing law, basically because they're providing services to clients, and their clients are responsible in some way, for telling, to some extent anyways, for what they're doing. Law is not inherently the turf of legal professionals. Law is much more the turf of the people who set the terms for conflict, which is kind of a different class of people. Not always, obviously, lawyers get involved all the time, but there's a kind of agency in disputes that is not inherent to legal professionalism, but that it is much more about is kind of law is more the turf of those people than it is of legal professionals, in my opinion. Here's another myth, kind of off of the territoriality one. International law, global law doesn't exist. It's not true. These conflicts exist, and therefore this law exists. And there's lots of globally, internationally recognized legal norms. For example, the prohibition on genocide. There's lots of legal norms that are internationally recognized but that aren't ratified in local legal systems. So another myth, law is fundamentally about power. Obviously, law mediates power relations because it governs how conflicts play out, but it's not really, it can't really be understood in terms of people's intentions because it's emergent from their conflict. And it's not really just a language and means of getting compliance because it's like the structure of the conflict. It's not like a means by which someone has conflict. And people believe that law is inherently hierarchical. And this is just untrue also because no one is above the law. No one can have complete sovereignty in governing the law. Not even the most powerful people or nation states in the world have that kind of position in law. And since everyone is subject to law and everyone is subject to the rule of law, in my opinion, although that one's a little more questionable, rule of law is like a concept that says that, like, you know, the rule of law, like the law should rule over people as opposed to vice versa. But even if people are governing law, it's not going to be the case that any one of them is in a complete monopoly position. And so basically, and the way that people resolve disputes also isn't inherently about people's positions in hierarchy, but about like the facts of the case and the particular law governing that dispute. You know, everyone has rights under the law, even people in disadvantaged positions. So, permissionlessly innovating in the law. This is like the kind of, now we get to, so the reason why I had to do the legal myths first is basically that there's a lot of these legal myths are going to stop you, if you believe in them, from participating in some of the legal questions that and legal issues that we have. And so this section now I'm going to talk about some tactics for how you can participate in law without permission, without having like a special authority or special position in society that gives you advantage. And like I mentioned, everyone has rights afforded by law. Everyone has some capacity for legal agency, and permissionless innovation in law is possible. So here's the first tactic: have disputes and manage conflict. Everyone has people and things in their life that they're able to dispute, and that they are able to think about disputing or accepting, and you actually can exercise agency in how you manage conflict in your own life. And it's incredibly important to understand that this is exercising agency to some extent at the margin of the law, where basically like you and all of the people that you can have in conflicts with, you know, that conflict is governed somewhat by your legal matrix, the way that you see the disputes that you're having with them. And at the margin, you can change your legal matrix quite relatively easily. It's just changing what you think. But in any case, if you exercise agency in how you manage disputes, you can change the law in your immediate vicinity, in your kind of immediate legal context. And, you know, this can be incredibly powerful. You know, if you're being bullied at school, you can like change the way you're managing that dispute and end up being less bullied. And, you know, obviously, it's not always that easy, depending on your bullies, but you have some agency in how you manage conflict with them. You can try to like agree with parties to your disputes how you're going to handle them. There's limits to this, but basically people do this a lot. It's kind of the private legal pattern, where basically we'll agree beforehand, before we enter into a relation, how the disputes that arise are going to be handled. And this is like the basic pattern of private law. And there's limits to private law. You can't do this arbitrarily. There's you know, other people will come in and interfere with your disputes if you have like, if you know, agree to slavery in your, you know, and like, you know, or like lots of things that are just not legally allowed because of basically, you know, limits to private law. There's like limits to the extent that you can do this, that you can agree with people. But like every legal contract is kind of like this. You try to manage your disputes by getting some kind of agreement about what's going to happen if you have disputes. And you can dispute lots of things, not just, you know, the way someone behaved in a commercial interaction with you. You know, you can dispute norms, doctrines, just about anything you can identify and possibly change. So the scope of things that you dispute is also in your control to some extent. So having disputes and managing conflicts, like my first tactic for permissionlessly innovating the law. And no one can give you permission to have disputes or not, or it's not really necessary. So tactic number 2, I call it hack the matrix. So hacking the matrix is about changing the way people perceive and experience their disputes, or the way that they see other people's and disputes in general playing out. Hacking the matrix is, lets you change a lot at the margin by changing how people treat and think about the disputes that they have. Now, obviously there's limits here too, because like how persuasive can you really be to how many people, but still, you can, to some extent, just by changing the way people think about the disputes that they have and the conflict that they have, you can change a lot at the margin. You can use language to do this, but you can also, there's also situational things and kind of actions that you can take that expose or just force people's legal matrices to change, because now they're like observing a new kind of conflict, or they're seeing that things don't play out the way they expected, and this gets them to update their legal matrix and to be like, okay, maybe there's actually an exception here, or maybe this is not, maybe the law isn't the way I thought it was. And so you can do things also to kind of put pressure on people's legal matrices to change, because as they deal with reality, they have to update their worldview. Otherwise, they fall out of sync, and there's costs associated with that loss of context. And so you can just do things and create situations and have like the situational kind of actions, as opposed to like speech kind of actions or media, sharing media, that can change people's legal matrices. So, and you can create a new matrix. It's the third tactic. This is kind of, the idea here is like you create new contentious ground. You create space for a new law to emerge just by creating a place or a thing that people can have disputes about, and where they haven't really had disputes about before. Now, obviously, like their culture will carry in some legal matrix for this new context, but to some extent, you have the opportunity to exercise agency about the law that's going to exist in that space. You create a new battleground, you get to exercise some agency about what that looks like, and therefore how law plays out. So you get to choose, to some extent, the nature of the actions available in that space, and that constrains what law is even possible there. You get to, and you can also tightly associate the space with legal doctrines, so that when you get to the space and you learn about it, and you learn about how conflict happens there, you can kind of be tricked or educated into adopting a particular legal matrix. So that when you come to this space, you learn about what the culture is here, how people do conflict here. And that education kind of infects your legal matrix with assumptions about how disputes play out, and that creates legal order, because it stops you from engaging in certain disputes that you think you're going to lose. It like gets you to engage in disputes that you think you're going to win. So when you're creating a new battleground, a new place where people, or like a new artifact where people are going to have disputes about, there's an opportunity to associate with that artifact legal doctrines. And this is like association, like you like in the way that you learn about immutability when you learn about the blockchain. It's like almost in the same sentence you hear about both when you're like being taught about either. And so this tight association of legal doctrine with a particular area of disputes can create new legal matrix. And by new matrix, I don't mean like you create a whole separate world, but just that there's like a sub-world, where the assumptions and beliefs that people have are maybe different or deviating from legal norms somewhere else. Great. So those were the 3 tactics for permissionlessly innovating in law. Have disputes, conflict, hack the matrix, and create a new matrix. The third one is probably less well named. It's more like create a space with its own special matrix, or create a matrix that's associated with an artifact or a space, so that people who interact with that end up getting kind of infected or getting influenced by the legal norms and doctrines that are used around there. Great. So now let's turn to crypto law. Important topic. Let me take a sip of water. So what is crypto law? Crypto law is the law that governs disputes and conflict about cryptocurrency, blockchain, and other technology, like related tech. And another way, Crypto law is the structure of conflict and disputes about cryptocurrency, blockchain, and other related protocols. Here are like some classic case studies in crypto law. The Bitcoin block size debate, which is more like a war than a debate, and the Dow hard fork. These are like, some examples where like we saw conflict in crypto kind of play out in different ways. There's lots of other ones, including like the ProgPow thing, like the stock funds thing, like the recent Steam takeover. There's lots of case studies in crypto law all the time, actually, because people have lots of conflict in cryptocurrency. And then there's also case studies in national law that are related to crypto, and this is what people normally consider to be case studies about crypto law. But I usually focus on the actual disputes about the protocols, as opposed to disputes about how people use it. Although obviously, how people use the protocols locally, is also ends up also being a crypto law issue, right? Crypto law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of the world that people are already having conflict in. And so basically, crypto protocols have associated legal orders, super tightly associated. And law, and crypto law governs conflict about these protocols, and it governs also that legal order. And what happens is global crypto protocols establish global legal orders. Basically, protocols live in cyberspace, and people interact with them from all over the world, from behind their internet connections, and they kind of become bound to the legal matrices of these protocols as they learn how, and as they are kind of indirectly influenced by the way that disputes play out in those spaces. So, to some extent, so here's like an example. Imagine you like interact with some dApp on Ethereum, and then like the terms of service that they wrote are like void because they're not legally written like in a way that's recognized, and then you end up getting bound to like a court in New York because like that's where the company that incorporated that or like built that application was built so that you can basically have even accidentally legal orders be propagated with technology just because of the way that disputes ultimately play out around that thing. People will look for ways to bind disputes to their particular legal matrix, and if you give them that, sometimes you can accidentally propagate like a legal order that you don't even intend to with your application. But sometimes it's much less like accidental and much more deliberate. Like for example, in Bitcoin and Ethereum to a slightly less extent, are associated with legal doctrines that have like clear formal suggestions for how conflict should play out. Specifically, blockchain immutability is this global legal order that is established through the association of legal doctrine with technology. And so like pretty much everyone believes that if you try to like change the Bitcoin protocol and change it from like 21 million Bitcoins to like 23 or 20, that everyone will be like, no, like that's not going to happen. Immutability is, what they'll tell you one way or another. And basically everyone kind of believes in these and has legal matrix that disallows this kind of change. And so basically, the like blockchain immutability is like propagated through these legal doctrine and hacks people's legal matrix. It also creates, like deploying a blockchain also creates a space where people will have disputes. And so blockchain immutability is a global legal order that has been established through the association of doctrine with technology. And it places certain software above dispute. And this code is law fashion. It deviates from global legal norms everywhere. And the legal justification is basically that there's no other way to stop nation states and other powerful actors from capturing the protocol. This is like the formally, legally, why we have immutability is because we are afraid of capture. This is like the whole kind of story. And so actually, the blockchain immutability deviates from important legal norms and justifies it based on a foundation of legal myths. Legal myths that basically simplify what law is about, that basically hijack people's fear of the nation state, that hijack people's fear of power, of politics, and kind of convinces you that unless you have this fully autonomous software, there's not going to be any law here. It's going to be lawless. It's going to be like basically like the most powerful actor wins. So there's the kind of legal doctrine basically says that like anything but fully autonomous software will become legally captured, and so we have like, in my opinion, a kind of formal legal doctrine that defends immutability and is grounded in a bunch of myths about law. And there's very, very few actors with legal agency in crypto law. Most people don't even have like consciousness required to act in the space. Most people just accept immutability. They just accept all of the they just accept the way that conflict plays about crypto. They don't really have any impetus or agency in how that plays out. And people who do have agency in crypto law tend to subscribe to some of these legal myths, and they're unable to recognize the existence or importance of crypto law in its own right. And so a lot of people who have agency in crypto law are just focused on keeping it outside the reach of nation states, or just focus on a kind of legal strategy that has to do with making peace with nation states, but doesn't have anything to do with the managing of disputes about protocol definitions, use, naming, branding, etc. So many people with agency in crypto law are kind of either working to protect it from the nation-state system or to make it work with the nation-state system, but are basically only exercising agency inside of the context of national law. And so therefore they're acting in crypto law, but they're doing it from a legal matrix that only recognizes national law. And so they're kind of, even people who have agency in crypto law tend to be not directly working on crypto law, not really directly exercising agency in crypto law, but exercising agency in how national law deals with crypto, which is, of course, a crypto law issue, but it's not core to crypto law because crypto protocols fundamentally aren't territorial. They're not really to do with how people use them. They're protocol definitions and naming, etc. So basically, as a result, lots of people in crypto law today basically don't recognize crypto legal arguments. They don't really recognize anything that you could tell them about crypto law. They would recognize, and they're afraid of national law. And so you have to kind of, if you make legal arguments with them, talk to them about kind of the kinds of conflict that they recognize, like getting arrested, like being sued, like things that aren't really like crypto law outcomes, but are personal legal outcomes for them. And so, this is like another issue that if you try to persuade these people, you try to change their behavior, you try to say, look, like this is not lawful, like let's do better, and they like don't recognize the words, and so they just kind of keep going in their own matrix, in their own world, not really participating in crypto law fully or properly. And how do you have disputes with the people who have had success in the past of creating protocols, and then these protocols, they become kind of institutionalized almost immediately by the developers who maintain them and who can't really make big changes to them? How do you have disputes with Satoshi, with Nick Szabo, with Gavin Wood, with Vitalik? How do you fight these people about protocol definitions? This doesn't have like a really, really great or clear answer, because most of these people don't have like a legal interface for you to do that. Most of these people don't even, they kind of have their own legal worldview and their own agenda, and they're not really participating in conflict with each other about it. It's more like, it's like, would Gavin ever fight with Vitalik or Nick Szabo about how to govern Polkadot? No, right? And there's lots of different people who have agency in crypto law, but for the most part, they don't exercise it by fighting with each other. And the crypto law associated with different crypto protocols is quite different. But it doesn't really vary is the global scope of the legal order or of the ambition for people's use of the protocol, and therefore of the impact of that legal order. Public blockchains and permissionless blockchains are grounds for global law. And whether it's Libra or a national blockchain project or an immutable one, they have an associated legal order, and it's very consequential what this is, because these are really, really high stakes. And furthermore, here's like a big issue in crypto law. It's kind of from a broader issue in software law. The legal model in software, for the most part, isolates engineers, architects, and developers from liability and assumes that people voluntarily use the software as if like they meaningfully consent to it and therefore can waive their rights when interacting with that software. And so, this is the predominant legal model. And even, as going as far as saying that like software is speech, so it's like additionally politically protected, not just, and not only, is it just protected by the waiver of liability that people can, that is assumed that people are able to do when they approach software. So like legal order in software today is quite bad, in my opinion. Quite bad. Very bad. A lot of people don't really understand software, and oops, I was supposed to say software people don't understand law. There's a lot of risk actually to the public today because of legal order in software, which basically allows for huge costs for the public, but no disputes that stick against the people who cause them. And so, and which is not to say that law people understand law or that software people understand software. These are incredibly complicated things, and like even professionals who work in the space have no, real computer science or legal philosophy backgrounds. And so, just because you work with something doesn't mean that you actually understand it. And then when you're working at the intersection of things that people don't understand, and not only don't understand, but have like all sorts of myths about and use it improperly all the time, it's a recipe for disaster. It's like a complex dispute about things that are super powerful outside and like that we don't really control or that we don't really know how to control. And so the law of software already sets us up for failure. Like the legal order in software development globally like sets us up for failure. And in crypto law, we have, it's kind of even worse. And no matter how it plays out, no matter whether the permissionless immutable blockchains win or in international corporate protocols or national blockchains, there's like a serious risk for global public because of the way that people use it, the way that people, like for example, imagine like evidence that's on the blockchain is admissible in court, and if it's not on the blockchain, it doesn't exist. Like you can imagine all sorts of crazy kinds of things that people want to do in order to manage disputes with blockchain, and which is not even to mention disputes about blockchain, and there are like all sorts of issues around blockchain governance and all sorts of risks, and basically, crypto law actually poses this risk more than the technology does, because the technology doesn't govern how we use it. It doesn't say how people think about how they govern it, but crypto law does. Crypto law does govern that. And basically what happens is, we have these global protocols and they pose global risks to the global public, and no one, almost, recognizes the need to deal with crypto law outside of national law. No one almost recognizes the deal with software law outside of national law. And these disputes are not inherently territorial. They're about protocol definitions and the way that we use protocol. And so we have basically a legal culture that isn't prepared to deal with crypto law issue directly. And so as a result, we have huge risks and people who basically aren't able to recognize them and aren't able to therefore deal with them. And so therefore the few people with agency in the space, the Nick Szabos of the world, the Gavin Woods of the world, they see opportunity to do crazy stuff, and they're not really held accountable by anyone because they get to basically compete in an open market. In this kind of open market, I think I lost the slide. So what happens in crypto, the kind of like equilibrium in crypto today is that like you take the software as is provided, with like a liability waiver, and then it's up to the market for competition between protocols to determine outcomes. And so so these actors are mostly just rushing to market, trying to get their protocol adopted and accepted by market makers and all of the different market participants in order to get their protocol to win. And this is kind of the way conflict plays out in crypto today. It's like you just got kind of a free-for-all race, and whoever wins the race gets to impose their crypto legal order on the world. And it doesn't sound safe to me because we well know that this market is not efficient. It's path dependent, and path dependent markets are generally not efficient. So, conclusion, nice, I made good time. So what can we do? Well, there's a lot we can do, and permissionlessly. We can have disputes in crypto law. For example, I dispute the immutability norm and the doctrine and the whole everything that's associated with it. For me, is just like I'm fighting till the death. I don't know what means, but if you hang out around me and you believe in that stuff, you're gonna get some dissonance. And I hope it hurts, and I hope that you change your mind. And I'm going to continue to dispute the immutability doctrines because I think they're just so wrong, it's not even funny. We can hack the matrix. We can change how people understand the way disputes play out in cryptocurrency. I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to get you to imagine a world where it's not the case that this code is above dispute, but where it actually can be disputed, and where these disputes, instead of playing out like, sorry, there's nothing we can do for you, are more like, let's see if there's something that we can do with that's reasonable. Because there's at the end of the day, certain decisions in blockchain governance that are possible, and there are going to be there are limits to crypto law just because of the limits to decisions about protocol. But to determine whether there's something that anyone can do for you, isn't just a matter, for me, of looking at the immutability norm and saying no, take it home, but a matter of looking at the tech reality and seeing whether or not there's anything that's technically feasible to deal with, this conflict, especially if, it's not a frivolous dispute, but a dispute that's based on sound crypto law work. So we can hack the matrix. Try to do that, and you can create a new matrix. It's the third tactic. And I invite you to have disputes and conflict in crypto law, this space where we have conflict about protocol definitions, use and naming, implementations, etc. And this kind of space is not national law, right? It's not to do with disputes with the legal persons that have territorial monopolies on violence in a geographical region. These are about disputes about protocol definitions and naming. And this is a whole space where we can have disputes, and the norms that we use here are obviously very deviant from legal norms in other places. But I invite you to have way more disputes, to not imagine that this is settled, that crypto law is decided as immutability, but that this is actually a full space where we can have disputes and where we can have a legal order that actually is the result of the way that people who consciously kind of know that they're having disputes about crypto law have disputes about crypto law. I also invite you to launch your own protocols with legal doctrines that you think about, instead of accidentally porting some national legal doctrines or immutability or some corporate governance, or just kind of having this unthinking, reflexive attitude. Instead of just accepting the legal realities of your protocol as being inherited from the context in which you're deploying it, think actively about what do the people who use your protocol believe about the conflict that they're going to have, possibly with other people who are possibly between themselves, about protocol definitions, about whatever. So I encourage you to, when you're launching a protocol, to think very carefully about this. Don't launch an application and unwittingly bind everyone who uses it to a New York jurisdiction. Don't unwittingly launch an application and bind everyone to an immutable legal order just because that's the dominant culture in the space. You should think carefully about how people will use your protocol, about how they're going to have disputes about your protocol, and to exercise agency rather than to accept whatever's going to happen and act like it's not your responsibility. So please, everyone has agency, and everyone can participate to avoid bad outcomes in crypto law, if you just know to pay attention. Crypto law poses global legal risks, but there's also incredible global legal opportunities. the fact that someone can come up with a technology, associate a legal doctrine with it, propagate it, and have a kind of deviant legal order associated with that tech is astounding and amazing, and it will change the world, and it has changed the world. And this is a tremendous opportunity, as much as it's a tremendous risk. And there's a lot of need for global law in cyberspace and on Earth in general. You know, we have a lot of global legal problems that are poorly addressed under the national legal matrices that people are living under. And so, you know, it's not, I'm not just trying to scare you, but I also think that, like, you know, it's something that if you want to make an impact, that you should consider being involved in. But on the scaring side, you know, if you see it and do nothing, then there's a good chance that one day you're going to have a lot on your conscience, because we are not heading for nice disputes. You know, we're heading for kind of nasty outcomes. And if you see this and you do nothing, then you kind of had the opportunity to exercise agency, and if you're like one of the few people who has a lot of power in the space, then, you know, I think that will be a higher burden to bear. And this is kind of the most important piece of advice, like a pleading, like, don't obstruct crypto law. You know, don't be territorial, don't engage in crypto grandstanding. You know, you don't want to exclude people from participating. We need as much input from different cultures as possible. We can't be territorial about crypto law. It's really, really, you know, really not helpful, especially when there's so many law myths. And so, and don't, if you know that it's a myth, like, don't spread it. Like, don't spread harmful law myths. Like, all of those myths that I listed are actively harmful in crypto law, because people, you know, believe them, and it stops them from even thinking about how to properly manage these disputes, because it seems like it's not their responsibility. It seems like, you know, law is not the right approach, whatever it is. Legal myths really harm crypto law. It stops people from doing crypto legal analysis properly, which means that, like, they aren't really able to navigate crypto law because they don't really understand how disputes play out with these nerds who, you know, have like a very different perception of how disputes are going to play out, you know, or at least some of them. Anyways, so, like, you know, it doesn't help your legal analysis to believe law myths. It doesn't help other people's. It gets people confused. It creates systemic issues. So please don't spread law myths. And stop looking for other people to take responsibility. You know, it's a constant thing where people, like, think that they need authority or permission or to be specially blessed to do a certain task by someone. You know, but if you see the need, contribute. I mean, this is the model of permissionless innovation. I think it's like my favorite model of decentralization. You know, if you see a need and you see how to do it better, just do it. You don't need to wait for other people to do it better. You don't need for other people to recognize that you recognize how to do it better. Stop looking for other people to take responsibility or to grant you permission. If you know the importance, come help. And we can definitely do better. Thanks a lot for listening.
So any question?
Yeah, we have 10 minutes for questions. It's amazing.
Thanks a lot for this talk. It was really amazing. I think it's much more mature than the idea you already started to have last year.
Sorry, than the what?
The idea you already started last year, when you were ready to die on this hill.
What do you mean? It's the same hill?
Yeah, it's the same hill, but you got much more mature at explaining and
I've been practicing all year.
Yeah, so remember
all year.
The last time we met, I had to say that you were saying exactly what Zabo is saying, but now it's completely different and it really changed the world. But I think that the point I wanted to emphasize is that it's not about crypto law. It's about how tech disrupt legal. Legal has never, they don't understand software, as you said, and they've never been really digitalized, so they're discovering computer. And it's our tech disrupting legal, and everything they know, they think and crypto is particularly interesting because there is governance, there's a lot of things that impact directly legal.
I mean, I think that like tech does impact the law because people have to have disputes about tech and with tech. However, I think that what we have in crypto is like is not just tech. It's like tech in a particular socioeconomic context, and tech is always in a particular kind of context: political, socioeconomic, legal context. And then like the particular doctrines that are associated with the technology are highly relevant. Like if we didn't associate blockchain technology with immutability as the reason why it's trusted, we'd be living in a different world. So you know, it's also about sociology, you know, like law, like tech doesn't exist in a vacuum. So I mean, I agree that tech is at issue because it leads to lots of complicated disputes and complicated ways that people have conflict. But you know, I don't think tech fundamentally disrupts law at all. It's just, you know, law adapts to tech just like it adapts to anything. You know, I would say that like there's a tremendous need for legal professionals that serve crypto law. But you know, so I think there's actually like, and not only that, but there's like a whole industry of crypto lawyers already that serve people's needs in national law. And so, you know, like I think that lawyers are the opposite of disrupted by crypto law or by crypto. I think that they have like this opportunity to make money personally and to improve their personal professions, like, you know, their career paths. Like I think for most law people who are getting into crypto, I mean, it's an opportunity, and they see it as an opportunity. They don't see it as being disrupted, and I think for good reason.
The current status for legal is, you're right, this is a current status, but the vision that's what blockchain can bring to the society, to human interaction, I think that's where it disrupts, like tech disrupted with internet already interaction, and like Web2 did also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I'm not sure if I agree, but please pass the mic because you know we have time for more questions. Anuj and Vitalik. I want Anuj and Vitalik. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm wondering if you have seen any good examples of crypto law yet.
Good examples of crypto law. Yeah, I mean, I think the DAO hard fork was excellent. I think the DAO hard fork represented a lot of in-context legal judgment about like the various disputes that were happening, and I think it's like a nice. It's like usually what I think about when I think about like the kinds of coordination that should happen in response to like really serious conflict. And you know, it wasn't perfect. That there was problems, but. Yeah, that's normally what I think about, but you know, I would say that like it's not looking good overall. Yeah, please.
Hey,
V.
So I mean, first of all, I don't feel like I'm that difficult to have disputes with. You know, I even had a dispute with Nick Szabo, and the guy blocked me on Twitter. But anyway, what's your least favorite crypto law other than immutability?
So I mean, that's a good question. I mean, immutability is such a dominating norm that it's like it doesn't leave room for almost anything else. Like almost nothing is allowed at all.
Free minds are allowed.
Although, I think you know. You know. It's tough. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do I consider calling everything a scam to be part of crypto law? Hey, Anuj is next. Anuj has a question. I don't understand your question, Alexi. Anuj is over there. He has his hand up.
Hey.
Hi.
Sorry, I've been living in France too much, so they do this. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, you know, when you said, and you know, I've told you this before, that what is law? You give a very ontology-heavy definition. I find it difficult because it's not the same thing for different people, different stakeholders. So, like, let's say national law, right? When you have a new law instituted, it means different for the enforcers. They have a different incentive, for example, than, say, the subjects of the law, than, say, the legislators of the law. So even in the crypto law, it's the same thing. I think part of the confusion that happens in crypto law is it's not the same, the crypto law for the designers of the protocol or the architects than for the users. And unfortunately, they don't see that. They only have a mono stakeholder perspective. They don't have a spectrum stakeholder. Like, they don't have multiple stakeholders with different incentives. So,
Yeah. So I mean,
maybe
yeah, definitely. Just it's very clear that people have different positions in the law, and their experience of the law is going to be very different as a result. And even I would say I would go as far as to say that like the legal myths that are sustainable for them to believe are going to vary tremendously based on what their legal position is, because like they see a different side of the elephant, and therefore they only something
but
makes sense
is
there.
there an elephant? My point is there an elephant
Yeah,
that they're
absolutely.
saying?
Yeah.
So there is ultimately a fundamental elephant.
Yeah. And at least when I'm talking about the law, there is in my definition, right? Like if you use another definition, that's you knock yourself out. But
I can't define, but that's exactly why I cannot define.
So I have the definition, and this is kind of what I'm using. And maybe it's not the most formal, perfect definition in the world. It could be better. But the idea here is basically that law is between all of the conflicts that's possible. And so if you can think about, say, for example, where that conflict exists, what are all the sources of this of the ways that conflict plays out, that's where law is, and I understand that you're objecting to like the monolithic existence of the law. However, it's important to recognize that law exists outside of your legal matrix and outside of anyone's legal matrix, because if not, then somehow you would imagine that the ways that the disputes and conflict that I have or that anyone has is structured is just a function of what people perceive and believe and how they act. And we know there are subjective worlds. And that's kind of, I think, it doesn't recognize the existence of law outside of experience or outside of the self or outside, and that I think is, shows somehow that that's kind of problematic. Because
so you would say that when there's legal order, there's disputes, but not the other way around always.
Sorry.
If there's legal order, there's already disputes, a priori, but not the other way around.
No, it's both ways.
So we don't need two words.
So I use legal order to mean the structure, and the law to be a little more broad, because I'm thinking also about
disputes and law. We need two words, or they're the same. Like they have a family.
Yeah, so
cousin
it's different, right? Because the disputes are governed by law, and so it's not like law is the dispute. Law is like the structure that governs it. It's like the structure in which it takes place. It's like the process by which it all plays out. It's so it's not enough to just say disputes. Although I could always have a bunch of words instead of law.
There would be no disputes without law.
Without disputes, there would be no law.
I think the other way around also.
And without law, yeah. So if law didn't exist, that would mean that there was no disputes. Although
it's a weird. Exactly. There's nothing to dispute about. It's like a chicken and egg, and it's like
it's just like the causation doesn't work like that. Like disputes cause law, and law causes disputes also, but kind of like the disputes are the bottom.
Without law, there's nothing to dispute about, because there is no like stable basis to dispute about.
No, totally not. No. I mean, yes. I mean, kind of. I would say this way: like disputes create law, which create disputes, which create law, which create disputes, and the bottom is the disputes. That's the way I bottom it out.
I think it's more spiral.
I like to have induction, and as opposed to circularity. You have induction with a starting point.
We are having a dispute right now. We are having a dispute right now.
Maybe, I don't know. I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, for me, this is just an argument.
Any other question? What's your case on checking for or testing for implicit trust in systems that humans build for each other?
How do you test for implicit trust?
Yeah, basically, how do you measure it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know. That's a tough question. I would maybe rephrase to say, like, okay, what how do you test if someone? I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I think it's too big. The question is too big. Sorry. Anyone else?
Hey, thanks for the talk. Do you believe that thinking of blockchains as DAOs more generally would help chip away at immutability thinking?
Kind of. I mean, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, maybe. Paul, give it to Paul. He's right behind you.
Well, you talk about innovation, creating new crypto law, but you didn't talk about the dangers of doing this.
Yeah.
For example, it's a matter of sovereignty. We can create a new crypto law now and occupy this site and create some bonding curve to manage its governance, etc., etc. So it's a danger to create a new crypto law, and it's in conflict with other legal orders. So how we can think about the conflict between different legal orders?
So that's a great question. So definitely legal orders don't exist in isolation of each other exactly. You know, but I would say that like we already have it really bad as it is. So like, you know, there is danger, but like fully autonomous software is just about as bad as it can get, I think. And so I am concerned about it getting worse, but I'm more concerned about just getting, you know, the status quo. And so I guess like I'm so urgently concerned about the status quo that I didn't stress that as much, although I tried a little bit in the disclaimer. But yeah, definitely none of this stuff is low stakes. And that means that if you screw up, or if it screws up, it could be quite bad. I mean, you could imagine a world where, you know, some major nation state has the most popular public blockchain in the world, and their courts resolve the disputes that happen on this, like, on the global scale. And you know, that could be, that's like one disaster. That's like very possible. There's a number of ways that it could go badly, and definitely, you know, today, like the legal order we have in crypto is very much in conflict with existing legal orders. Although I would say it's doctrinally inconsistent, and the conflict is not really there yet. I mean, the conflict is coming because of the like collision course that we're kind of on. Yeah.
Yes. Just what place you give in this of illegal action when some legal order don't permit or have too big spread between it and legitimacy?
Yeah, so I mean, so illegal is this concept that like it's against the laws or against somehow against the legal order, or you know, I usually prefer the term unlawful because the opposite of illegal is normally said to be legal, but then we talk about everything being like a legal construct or whatever, and that gets confusing. And so you know, I mean, I think that like I would say that like it's super important. You know, this question of like what conduct in crypto is lawful and not, and today it's kind of indeterminate. But you know, when you say that, I think you might mean illegal under the laws of a particular nation state, and then how do we worry about that? Or do you mean like more globally unlawful? Yeah. Okay. Oh. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So I mean, but you know, it almost sounds like you're saying the only lawful thing to do is to do something illegal, and it's kind of this paradoxical thing where basically, you know, it's sometimes lawful to go against the legal order, and sometimes it's not. It depends on the circumstances. And it more has to do with like whether or not it's defensible, or whether or not someone or the world around you will take you down for doing it. I mean, in an exceptional circumstance, you can behave far outside of the legal norm, and people will recognize the exceptional circumstance and not bother you. In a normal circumstance, if you behave far outside the norm, people will be like, bring down the law on you. And so, you know, it sounds like what you're describing is an exceptional circumstance in which it's lawful to go against the legal order. And that totally, totally happens. And it's something that, you know, positive legal theories don't have a super great grasp on, but which I think I can provide a nice, I think that was a nice description.
Thank you, Vlad,
thanks.
for this conference.
Thank you so much for the questions. Really appreciate it. No worries, I understand. I just went as long as I could, like, you know. Thank you.
Pour les speakers, je vais aller changer celui-là. Okay. Voilà, donc ils utilisent celui-ci, je vais en ramener un autre pour les deux. D'accord, ok. La batterie.
La prochaine intervenante, c'est elle?